Have you ever looked at today's massive government laboratories, the civilian space agencies, or those trillion-dollar research budgets, and just assumed it was always this way? Well, welcome to The Explainer. Today we are completely unpacking the hidden history of U.S. science policy. It turns out the origins of the modern American scientific establishment are actually pretty surprising. They begin in an era when the young republic had practically nothing to its name. And honestly, the very idea of the government funding science at all was highly controversial.
To really understand where we started, listen to this rather stinging critique from a sitting U.S. president in 1825. In his very first annual message to Congress, John Quincy Adams stated, "Europe has 130 lighthouses of the skies compared with no observatories worthy of the name in the United States." It's a fantastic quote, right? It immediately establishes his incredibly grand vision while also frankly admitting to the young nation's scientific inferiority. He was basically calling for a massive federal investment in knowledge, which, at the time, was a completely revolutionary concept for the U.S. government.
Now, Adams didn't just dream up this agenda out of nowhere. If you trace his path, it makes total sense. Back in the 1780s, as a young man, he was a diplomatic observer in Paris. He was literally rubbing shoulders with founders like Jefferson and Franklin, who were deeply plugged into the European scientific community. Fast forward to 1809, and he's serving as minister to the Tsar in Russia, where he's closely studying astronomy and watching the rise of state-sponsored Russian observatories. So by the time he takes the presidency in 1825, he is fully primed to propose a comprehensive national science agenda, completely inspired by the absolute best institutions Europe had to offer.
But here is the massive hurdle he faced, and it's a big one. We can call it the constitutional void. The U.S. Constitution is practically silent on the topic of science. It really only mentions it indirectly, giving Congress the power to issue patents, coin money, and fix weights and measures, and that is it. Because of this silence, early leaders hesitated. People seriously questioned whether the federal government even had the legal authority to fund research or build permanent institutions like national observatories. This constitutional void forced early science policy to be extremely cautious and heavily debated.
So we end up with this crucial clash of visions. On one hand, Adams championed a highly centralized strategy. We're talking a national university, a naval observatory, and an entire department of internal improvements to provide top-down management for scientific progress. But the reality that actually emerged from all that political pushback was entirely decentralized. To get anything done without triggering a constitutional crisis, the government had to rely on independent contracts with state universities, temporary surveys, and a really piecemeal pluralistic funding system.
And you have to understand, the political opposition to Adams was incredibly fierce. During the 1828 election, there was this massive anti-science backlash. Adams's grand proposals were openly mocked by his populist opponents as dangerous, ridiculous, and just a huge waste of taxpayer money. They feared a quote-unquote monarchical government that was overstepping its bounds. Even that beautiful phrase, lighthouses in the skies, basically became a political punchline. Ultimately, Andrew Jackson defeated Adams in what felt like an anti-science referendum. At that moment, it really seemed like the absolute end of the road for American science policy.
But as historian A. Dupree's definitive research points out, the story definitely doesn't end there. Even after a crushing presidential defeat, John Quincy Adams actually returned to Congress as a representative. And there, he quietly but absolutely relentlessly championed these scientific policies until his dying breath on the floor of the House in 1848. He became the persistent engine of a decentralized, pragmatic approach that would ultimately shape the entire future of American science.
To really grasp how this pragmatic approach worked in practice, you have to hear the saga of Ferdinand Hassler. Hassler was a brilliant, highly trained Swiss scientist, and his turbulent career perfectly captures the early struggles of government-funded research. First, he gets hired by Thomas Jefferson in 1807 to run the Coast Survey. Then, in 1818, he is unceremoniously dismissed to cut costs because Congress abruptly decided only military officers should be doing the job. But incredibly, he returns in 1830, under President Andrew Jackson of all people, as an independent civilian contractor.
The sheer audacity of Hassler is just legendary. When he was negotiating his return with President Jackson, he demanded an outrageous salary. Jackson pushed back, pointing out that his own Secretary of the Treasury, Mr. Woodbury, didn't even make that much money. Hassler reportedly stood up and declared, "Mr. Woodbury, there are plenty of Woodburys, but there is only one Hassler for the head of the Coast Survey." He essentially looked the President of the United States in the eye and said politicians are completely replaceable, but top-tier scientific talent is rare and absolutely vital.
And the punchline to all of this? Jackson actually agreed. He gave Hassler a whopping $6,000. That was an astronomical sum back then. literally equal to a cabinet secretary's pay. More importantly, it established a vital precedent. Top scientific talent requires premium support, and the government was willing to pay for it through special contracts, even if they refused to build a massive, centralized national university.
So how exactly did government science survive its early days? Well, they executed a pragmatic pivot. They completely bypassed those philosophical debates about constitutional limits. Instead of fighting tooth and nail for permanent institutions, they relied on temporary appropriations. They cleverly blended civilian scientific leadership with existing military resources, like the Navy and the Army's topographical engineers. And they leaned heavily on independent contractors, exactly like Hassler. It was messy, it was decentralized, but it absolutely worked. This became the foundation of what we can call the Adams-Hassler tradition.
Which naturally brings us to a fascinating question. How did this scrappy, decentralized, 19th century workaround survive and evolve all the way into the nuclear age? Because obviously, the scale of government science looks very, very different today.
The answer really lies in the post-World War II era, where this decentralized tradition rapidly expanded into a multi-billion-dollar bureaucratic megastructure. In 1945, the Wartime Office of Scientific Research and Development transitions to peacetime. By 1946, we get the Atomic Energy Commission and the Office of Naval Research. In 1950, the National Science Foundation is created, and by 1958, NASA is founded as a civilian agency. All of these massive entities were built on that fundamental concept of the government contracting with independent universities and scientists. It's essentially the very system Adams and Hassler pioneered, just on an imaginable scale.
However, the Cold War introduced a radical shift, a true nuclear departure from the old ways. Figures like the physicist Dr. Edward Teller started to heavily challenge the traditional model. Teller pushed for centralized, highly classified weapons labs rather than open university partnerships. He prioritized applied Cold War research and weapons development over fundamental open science. He even went so far as to advocate directly to the president for the hydrogen bomb, completely circumventing the standard diplomatic and scientific advisory channels that had been in place for decades. To really put the scale of this departure into perspective, just look at the numbers. We go from Ferdinand Hassler demanding $6,000 for surveying equipment to line items like $1 trillion proposed for things like the Strategic Defense Initiative, or Star Wars, in the 1980s. This highlights how government procurement and defense spending completely ballooned, sometimes entirely bypassing the traditional oversight, open debate, and careful budgetary processes that define the earlier Adams tradition.
Think about the stark contrast between these two paradigms. The Adams tradition valued university and government partnerships, open, fundamental research, and international scientific cooperation. The Cold War departure, on the other hand, leaned heavily into secret national laboratories, applied weapons research, and the sheer pursuit of unilateral technological dominance. It represents a fundamental divergence in how a nation views the ultimate purpose and the day-to-day management of its scientific endeavors.
But here's the silver lining. The original Adams vision never truly died. Despite the intense secrecy and the incredible pressures of the Cold War, the tradition of international scientific diplomacy stubbornly persisted. Scientist administrators like Glenn Seaborg and Herbert York championed arms control, university partnerships, and landmarked agreements like the Nuclear Test Ban treaties. They genuinely believed, much like Adams did, that science could be a powerful bridge between nations, not just a tool for conflict.
And that brings us to what might be the ultimate realization of Adams's dream. In 1975, the US-Soviet Apollo-Soyuz space docking occurred. American and Soviet astronauts literally shook hands in orbit. It was the physical realization of Adams's once-mocked lighthouses of the skies. Two rival superpowers, cooperating in the name of science and exploration, high above the Earth, proving that his vision of international scientific endeavor had finally actually come to pass.
Which leaves us with a final, provocative thought to consider today. Does our modern scientific megastructure still honor the vision of its forgotten founder? As we fund brand new space missions, build advanced artificial intelligence, and tackle massive global challenges, are we leaning into open cooperation or secret competition? It is exactly the question John Quincy Adams was asking 2 centuries ago, and it's one we absolutely must still answer today. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the history behind the systems we take for granted.